Welcome everyone to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. After her successful and respected career in the United States Air Force, Dr. Bjorkman is the executive director of the Air Force Test Center, and in the process has added a definitive book and also established herself as a respected author. Unforgotten in the Gulf of Tonkin, a story of the U.S. military's commitment to leave no one behind. And as for today's topic, we're privileged to have someone who not only lived the experience but wrote the book on the subject. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to welcome Colonel Eileen Bjorkman.
Thank you, Cindy. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming out. So I'm going to be talking today, this is actually my third book, the Fly Girls Revolt, the story of the women who kicked open the door to fly in combat. So I often, you heard that I'm a retired colonel, and when I was on active duty, and I still get asked this question a lot, did you go to the Air Force Academy? And I always say, I graduated from high school in 1974, and women couldn't go to the Air Force Academy until 1976. And I'm amazed at how many people go, oh, I forgot about that. Younger people go, I had no idea there was a time when women couldn't go to the Air Force Academy. And people have also forgotten that there was a time when women couldn't fly in combat, when women couldn't fly airplanes at all in the military. So that was why I wrote this book. It's really a 50-year history. It focuses on the women of my generation, the women aviators of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, who were the ones that set the stage and made that final push to open combat aircraft to women, to get us to where we are today. So even though the focus of the book, like I said, is on about a 20-year period, I have to start the history 50 years prior to that, back in World War II. And there's a group of women, I think most of you have probably heard of, the WASP. I'll talk about them for a few minutes. I'll talk a little bit about what happened in the 50s and 60s. I call that the doldrums, because it wasn't a great time to be a woman in the military. And then the opening of aviation to women finally in the 70s. And then the 80s, which was kind of a period of confusion, I'll call it. And then getting into Desert Shield and Desert Storm in 1990 and 1991, which was really the inciting event that finally pushed women mostly to the finish line. It still took a couple more years until 1993 when they finally got across the finish line. So first, the WASP. I think a lot of you, if you're aviation history aficionados, are familiar with the WASP, the Women Air Force Service Pilots. They were formed in September 1942. There was actually originally two groups that merged into the WASP. The original two groups were the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which was led by Nancy Harkness Love. She hired very experienced women pilots that had over 500 hours of flying time. There weren't that many women in the US at that time that had more than 500 hours of flying time. There weren't that many men in the US that had that much flying time. So they also formed the Women's Flying Training Detachment, which was led by Jacqueline Cochran, who was a famous aviatrix, had won races and did all sorts of daring things. And she took the less experienced women, and they went through essentially Army flying training down in Texas, and then went off to ferry aircraft. So now the women, they never flew overseas. There were a handful of women who did fly overseas in the UK as contractors, but these women, for the most part, they stayed in the United States. They ferried aircraft around. They towed targets. They did all sorts of support kinds of missions. The idea was to free up men to be able to do combat tasks. So, and then, like I mentioned, the two organizations were merged into just the one organization led by Jacqueline Cochran in 1943. And then the women were civilians. They were brought into, they were formed. There were actually women in the military at the time. There was all of the services had branches or components for women, but in order to not have to pass another bill with Congress, they brought the WASP in as civilians. And so there was a bill to try to get them to make them permanent military members. That bill failed, and one of the reasons that it failed was, the good news was that fewer men were, there was less attrition in combat, and so they didn't really need the women anymore, unfortunately for the women. So fortunately for the men, so yes, but it led to their disbandment actually before the war even finished. So, but they served very honorably, and it was kind of interesting, at the end of the war, they were actually commissioned as second lieutenants into the military, into a reserve status in the military. So, so there was kind of a recognition there that they had been in the military. So even though they were never actually in the military during the war itself. So after the war, there were a few women that remained to just kind of shut things down initially. The original legislation had only allowed women to stay in the military and the various components until the war's end, some time period after the war, for an orderly transition. But interestingly enough, the military commanders, including Dwight D. Eisenhower, were very impressed with the women, and they wanted to keep them in. And they didn't want a lot of women; they just wanted to have enough that they could build a base. You have a base that they could build on in another national emergency. So there was, like I said, there was actually a pretty strong push to keep at least some women in. So Congress did pass a 1948 law, and that established a permanent presence for women in the military. And at the same time, though, they did not want them to be in combat. So, and there was actually one senator was like, I don't care what we do, but they can't be on ships. So that was kind of a big thing. So as part of the law, they also passed a law that said that women could not serve in aircraft that engaged the enemy in combat, and they could not serve on combat ships. And the Navy, of course, considered pretty much all their ships combat ships, so that kind of took care of that. So there were also a lot of limitations. There actually was no prohibition against women flying aircraft, but all of the services did not allow women to fly by policy. They were limited to 2% of the force, so very tiny numbers. And the highest rank a woman could achieve was colonel. And there were only a handful of colonels because each branch only got one colonel. So you had, like in the Army, you had the women in the Army Corps colonel, and you had a colonel for the nursing corps in the Army. So I think there were about seven total women colonels that were allowed. And once a woman served as a colonel, if she was done with her 4-year tour as a director and she wanted to remain in the military, she had to take a demotion to lieutenant colonel to continue to serve. So there were also a lot of issues, on a personal level. If women could get married, but they could not claim their husbands as a dependent unless they could prove that the husband was totally dependent upon them. If a woman got pregnant, she got kicked out. If a woman gained a couple of kids through marriage, she got kicked out. So there were all these issues, with being a woman, and as a result, as you can imagine, women kind of got out at higher rates because of a lot of these issues. But finally, things started to change in 1967. They did lift the grade restrictions. A little bit of an interesting story here, that there had been, there's the group called DACAWITS, which looks out for women's issues and advises OSD, the Department of Defense, on women's issues. And they had been lobbying Congress for years to lift this grade restriction. Well, President Johnson had a staffer that worked for him who was a lieutenant colonel in the reserves, a woman staffer, and he wanted to get her promoted to colonel. And he was told, you can't. By law, she can't be a colonel. And he was mad, and you can imagine what he said, those of you who are familiar with LBJ and some of his colorful language. So that kind of helped push this legislation across the line in 1967 that opened up the doors for women to be able for more women to be able to become colonels, and it allowed women to become general officers as well. and then it lifted the 2% limit. So there's some other things happened. 1969, the Air Force decided to open ROTC to women. Up to that point, the only way a woman could get a commission was to pay for her own college and then apply for officer training school or officer commissioning school, depending upon what branch she was trying to go into. And there was no law against women being in ROTC. It was just policy. And Jean Holm, who I'll mention here in a minute, was a big proponent. She was Air Force Colonel, Director of Women in the Air Force. She was a big proponent of allowing, opening up ROTC, making it easier for women to get commissions. So in 1969, the Air Force did open ROTC, and Jane Leslie Hawley was the first graduate in 1971. She was a Georgia Tech graduate, and you're going to hear a little bit more about her in a minute here too. So 1970s, aviation finally started opening to women. But first, there were a few things that happened. In June of 1970, the Army beat the Air Force to the punch and promoted 2 women colonels to brigadier general. And then a year later, Jean Holm, who had been Women in the Air Force director, became the first Air Force brigadier general. So there were a couple of lawsuits that happened at that time. Women were starting to get a little bit frustrated by some of the limitations that were imposed on them. And the women's movement, by now was really starting to become very vocal. and women were starting to, rabble-rouse and say, hey, why are we kicked out if we become pregnant when a man is allowed to have as many kids as they want? So there were a couple of lawsuits that happened. One was a lawsuit, a woman who became pregnant, and the Air Force tried to kick her out, and like everybody else, and she filed a lawsuit, and it was working its way through the courts. And anyway, various things happened, and before it made it to the Supreme Court, it was going on its way to the Supreme Court. But before it got there, the Air Force decided to back off, allowed her to stay in. They sent her to Minot, North Dakota, for those of you who are familiar with that, but they did allow her to stay in. So, and then everybody else just kind of followed suit after that. So there was also a suit filed by a lieutenant at Maxwell Air Force Base because she couldn't get benefits for her husband. And it was the same thing. It's like, wait a minute, when a guy gets married, he gets more money. I get married, what's the matter here? So those of you who are familiar with Maxwell Air Force Base, it's in Montgomery, Alabama. The Southern Poverty Law Center was standing up there, and they took on her case, or one of the lawyers that stood that up took on her case. And so again, it made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in her favor. So, and I think an interesting footnote is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was a young lawyer at that time, actually represented the women, or partly represented the women, in both of those cases. So a couple of big events happened in the early 70s that really kind of opened the door to bring more women into the military. And the first of those was the draft ending in 1973, because when the draft ends, then you have to start relying on an all-volunteer force. And even though women weren't initially viewed as a solution to that problem, the recruiters quickly figured out that, oh yeah, women can do a lot of these same jobs, so let's start recruiting them. So the other thing that happened was the Equal Rights Amendment passed in March of 1972. Now, it hadn't been ratified yet, and it still hasn't been ratified to this day, but it scared the services half to death. And they were like, oh my gosh, this is going to force us to start bringing in lots more women. And so they just decided on their own that they were going to start bringing more women in. Now, it didn't exactly open the floodgates, but it certainly put a lot of pressure on the services to start bringing more women in, and also to start opening more career fields to them. Because there were a lot of women who did want to serve, but they're like, yeah, I don't want to sit behind a desk. Just like guys don't want to sit behind a desk. They wanted to be out there, on the flight line or on a ship or doing something, doing something more operational. So in 1973, and actually I think it was 1972, Admiral Zumwalt, who was very forward-thinking in terms of not just women, but people of color, using the strengths of everybody in the United States. He put out a policy saying that, hey, we're gonna bring some women into pilot training in the Navy. And so 1973, 6 women went through pilot training or started pilot training. And then in 1974, the first woman military aviator, actually in the military, received her wings. So, and that was Lieutenant Junior Grade Barbara Allen Rainey. You see a picture of her here. So this is one of the things I learned when I was doing my research that I didn't know, is that in the Air Force, if you go to pilot training, the whole class graduates together and they get their wings at the same time. In the Navy, they get their wings whenever they're done. So you wind up with these 6 women that all have different dates where they actually graduated. So you don't have a really cool picture of all 6 of them together, get ready to graduate like you do with the Air Force women. So, but anyway, the Army quickly followed suit. Not long after the Navy started training women, they started accepting women into training women as helicopter pilots. So, but the Air Force still refused to allow women into their pilot training. And their logic was that every pilot that goes through pilot training in the Air Force is a combat pilot. It doesn't matter if you're flying a C-141 after you graduate. We could take you and turn you into a fighter pilot on a moment's notice if we have to. So, and they actually did a little bit of that during Vietnam, so there might even be some people here who know something about that. So, but that was their logic, was that we don't have non-combat pilots in the Air Force. So. But some things did still start to kind of gradually happen, even in the interim there. So remember Jane Leslie Hawley, who I mentioned, she was the first woman to get a commission through ROTC. She applied for test pilot school. She was an engineer, and she applied for the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School around 1973 timeframe, and she was accepted, because she was going to be able to fly as a flight test engineer. The test pilot school doesn't train just pilots. They train navigators, they train flight test engineers, and a few other things. So, and apparently this didn't cause a lot of consternation when they saw her application at the board. She was qualified, she had good grades, and so they let her in. So, and some of you might know Roy Martin. He's done a lot here at the museum. He was in her class. So. And so anyway, this is a picture of her with F4 just shortly before she graduated up there in the summer of 1975. So the other thing that happened in 1975 was that Congress voted to open the service academies to women. And this was another big thrash. The service academies said, we don't take women because we train combat officers. And so therefore women can't go into combat, so why should we let them go to the service academies? And of course various people pointed out that not all of your graduates are in combat positions, and the Air Force was especially in a weak position, because I think at that time about 25 or 30% of the graduates were not going into combat jobs, they were going into other kinds of jobs, and that ratio is even higher now. So, but so eventually the reasons for why you shouldn't have women at the academies, the Congress said, no, we agree, or we disagree with you services, and you are going to take women. So the first classes actually started in 1976. The law changed in 75. But the Air Force still said, no, we're not going to have women pilots. So you can come to the academy, but you're not going to get to train as a pilot. So the women who were in that first class that showed up in 1976, they weren't sure if they were going to get to be pilots or not. And I talked to a few of them, and one of them didn't even know that. She's like, yeah, I didn't even know when I got there that she said, I just assumed I was going to get to go to pilot training, and she didn't realize that. Another woman did know, but she said she was willing to take the chance because she figured the rules would change before she graduated, and she was right. The Air Force finally opened up aviation, or piloting, because you had like women flight nurses and stuff. They finally opened up piloting to women in 1976. And this is the first class of 10 women that went through pilot training at Williams Air Force Base. They entered in the fall of 1976 and graduated about a year later. So And initially the class was considered an experiment, but the women did fine. All 10 that entered graduated, but there was just one problem. You're still only allowed to fly non-combat aircraft. So Connie Engel, who is, let's see, I'm trying to think how to, let's see, she's kind of in the middle. She's the tall one in the middle, kind of. And she graduated #1 in her class. Now, normally if you graduate #1 in your class, if you want to fly a fighter airplane or a bomber airplane, that's what you're going to get to go do. But she wasn't allowed to do that. But she was allowed to stay at Williams Air Force Base as an instructor pilot in the T-38. So that was about the best that a woman could do at that time, was to be able to fly a supersonic trainer, and because you couldn't do anything else. So now a lot of women that didn't bother. You had a lot of women that they weren't interested in flying fighters, just like not all men are interested in flying fighters. But for women who did well and wanted to fly a combat aircraft, it wasn't allowed. Now the Navy had similar issues, and in a lot of ways it was worse for the women in the Navy because they couldn't land on an aircraft carrier. At least an operational aircraft carrier. They did finally allow some women to start landing on their training carrier, I think it's the Lexington, and they did allow women to start checking out in tactical aircraft, such as the A4, but only so that they could help train men. So they weren't allowed to actually, be in a combat squadron. They were in some kind of a training squadron that helped to train men. But they did allow some women to start flying the tactical aircraft, and they even trained them in air combat tactics as well. So there were some Navy women who were allowed to do that sort of thing back in the 70s and 80s. So after they graduated from pilot training, the women went to various squadrons. One of them, Kathy Rambo, let me back up a second. She's the second one from I'm trying to think how you see this. So second from the right there, so kind of the short, dark-haired woman there. So she was actually a reservist, and she was flying C-141s. And about a year after she graduated from pilot training, she was on a mission over in Germany, and there was something came up in a hot spot down there in Africa, in Zaire, now the Republic of Congo. And so she wound up going on this mission, and they were flying into a relatively hostile area, carrying French troops around. And after about a week, somebody back in the United States figured out that there was a woman flying around in Zaire. They said, hey, you get back here. So, yeah. But they gave her an air medal for it. So she was the first woman pilot to earn an air medal. There were some nurses that had earned air medals prior to this, but she was the first woman pilot. So now we move into the 1980s. Now things are getting a little weird. There's a change of administration. The Reagan administration comes in, and the Reagan administration was actually supportive of women, but some of the things that people in the Department of Defense were doing made it appear as though the Reagan administration was not, because the services thought that the Reagan administration was not going to be as friendly to women as the Carter administration and the Ford administration before Carter. And so they thought, hey, this is an opportunity to actually reduce the number of women. Maybe we can even get back to the draft, because the services still were upset that the draft had gone away. Because the draft doesn't just help the Army. Even though people only get drafted into the Army, because of that, people who have who think that they're going to get drafted, they'll go, hey, I'm going to go talk to my Air Force recruiter, or I'm going to go talk to my Navy recruiter. And so the draft helps the other services as well. So there were a lot of studies that were going on at that time, trying to prove that, because they had given up on trying to prove that women couldn't do the job, because women repeatedly showed that they could do the job. But there were concerns that, well, we're getting too many women, they're hurting readiness, they're pregnant, there were all these reasons they had for why they were concerned about women. So they did study after study after study that showed that no, that wasn't a problem. Yes, women get pregnant, but men break their legs, men have more disciplinary problems. There was all sorts of reasons why women don't impact readiness. So And there were some other things that happened during the 80s. There was, again, a gradual opening, especially in the Air Force, of additional weapon systems, additional aircraft to women. For example, in 1982, the AWACS aircraft did open to women. So the women also started to organize, though, because they were starting to realize by this point in the 80s, they're getting to be, senior captains, young majors, lieutenant commanders in the, lieutenant commanders in the Navy. They're starting to realize that if I can't fly combat aircraft, I'm never going to get to the highest ranks of the services, because all of the people who become four-star generals, at least in those days, for the most part, they are people that either have combat experience or they're in some sort of combat arms, and so that's what the services value. And so this is very limiting to my career. It's also very difficult for a squadron commander, because if you have, like, say you are a C-141 squadron commander, and you have something come up, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute, but you have something come up where the 141s are going to be going into a hostile area, is it okay to send women or not? The rules were very vague, and so it caused a lot of problems. And so the women started to organize, and they established the Women Military Aviators. It was actually called something else in the beginning, but over time it evolved into that. And they also, what really happened was the WASP from World War II reached out to these women and started mentoring them. And so they kind of initially it started out as kind of a social organization, but eventually they started to advocate for themselves. They started writing letters to Congress. The Navy women were particularly vocal, and they wrote all sorts of letters to their bosses saying, you need to change these rules, and this is why it affects me. So again, the women were just starting to take things into their own hands. So 1983, the scenario I just mentioned about going into a hostile area happened. Margie Clark, who was a 1980 Air Force Academy graduate, flying C-141s at Charleston Air Force Base on the East Coast there. First she flew into Beirut. There was the barracks bombing in Beirut, and she flew in there. That was a hostile area, but her squadron commander didn't take her off the schedule. She was scheduled to fly, and she went over there. She got back from that, and just a few days later, Grenada kicked off, the action that we had in Grenada. And she flew down into Grenada. Again, a hostile area. She was on the schedule, and so she just went and flew. And you see her getting a commendation medal on the I guess it's your right there. So, and the thing I really like about this is, if you notice, she's pregnant. She's wearing a maternity uniform in that picture. So she was not pregnant when she went to Grenada, but it takes so long to process these medals that she was pregnant by then. So by the time she got it. So, but the thing that was interesting was that so there was also C-141s on the West Coast out here at like Norton Air Force Base at that time. Those women were not allowed to fly into Grenada because their commander said, no, that's combat, you're not going. And so you had, now this commander is, not only is he taking the women out of the airplane, but he's having to call men in to replace these women, men who were not scheduled to fly. Now they were probably on some kind of a standby or something, but still, they're having to come in to replace somebody just because she's a woman. Not because she broke her leg, or got sick, but because she's a woman. So it's really not fair to anybody. So 1986, Operation El Dorado Canyon, the raid on Libya. One of the things I was surprised to learn, I did not know this until I started my research, was that I knew that to get down to Libya and back, they had to have a lot of tankers, and France didn't allow overflight, and so they had to get even more tankers. Well, where are all the women pilots? They're flying tankers. So it was one of those things where when they were doing the planning, the guy in charge of the planning said, we are not taking women off the tankers. They're going. They're going to be part of this mission. And so you actually had 6 women across several KC-135s and KC-10s that went down and supported that particular mission. And one of the women on one of the KC-10s was actually, she was very involved in the planning as well. So, and there's a pretty interesting story in my book about that. So. There was also something introduced called the risk rule that was supposedly going to be used to open more positions to women. It didn't work so well in the Army, but the Air Force did start to open tactical airlift, C-130s, and also U-2s. So again, there was a little bit of progress there. But there were some other things going on that had the potential to set women back. The Air Force was starting to talk about going to a two-track pilot training system, which they eventually did. And so what would happen is, right in the 80s, starting in the 50s up to the 80s, you went through, everybody went through T-37 training for primary training, and then they went through T-38 training for their advanced training, and then they would graduate and go off to their aircraft. So what they were trying to do was to change it to where you start in the T-37, and then if you're going to be a combat pilot, if you're going to fly bombers or fighters, you go train in the T-38. If you're going to fly airlift or tankers, you're going to fly a different aircraft. You're going to fly like a little business jet kind of airplane. So, well, that all sounds well and good, and that's actually the way the Navy's done things for a long time. But what it did was it eliminated that T-38 instructor track for women. Because if women can't fly combat airplanes, we're not going to send any of them to fly the T-38, train in the T-38. So then they're not going to get to be T-38 instructor pilots. So as you can imagine, women were very up in arms about that, because it's like the only high performance airplane we can fly, and now you're taking that away from us. So the Navy was also starting to contract out some of those training positions that the women had been filling. So again, remember, some of the Navy women were allowed to fly in these tactical aircraft in a training environment, and the Navy was starting to contract some of those out as well. And so as a result, as you can imagine, women are starting to, women that we have spent a lot of taxpayer dollars on are starting to leave the services in droves. So, but then everything changed. 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in August and immediately kicks off Desert Shield, where we start bringing massive amounts of equipment and troops over to the Middle East. And so to get that stuff there, I mean, some of it goes by sea, but a lot of it goes by air if you want to get it in fast. And so, of course, women are flying your transports, your tankers, and they're the ones who are taking all of this equipment in. And then during the war itself, they're, of course, continuing to bring equipment in, fly people out, fly tankers on refueling missions, getting fighters, all the way up to Iraq. They would stop before they get into Iraq. The fighters top off, go in, do their job, come back, and then they all go home. So the women were very, very heavily involved in the war, and this was when people in the United States started to realize how dependent the military had become on women, because they saw women on TV all the time, and they saw not just the reserves were activated, and so people in small towns saw not just Johnny going off to war, but also saw Susie going off to war, their neighbors, and people started to really understand what women were doing and what their contributions were. And in total, during the Gulf War, 13 women died, 21 were wounded, and 2 were actually taken POW. So, and that was another thing that people had been concerned about, is that, oh my gosh, what happens if women become POWs? Well, it's about the same as what happens when men become POWs. So this is just a couple pictures from Desert Shield and Desert Storm. This is Stephanie Wells, a C-5 pilot, one of the loads of bombs that she was taking over there. And then this is, it's probably a little bit hard to see on here, but Army Captain Victoria Calhoun, she was a my brain is getting Chinook pilot, so yeah, and she actually flew into Iraq. So during the 100 hours of the ground war, she was part of the unit that moved all of the troops and the equipment and everything. She helped with all of that, shuttling everybody forward so that they could have their final push in the ground war there. So the war ends in February 1991. So, well, those of you who follow the defense budget process, that's perfect timing for the negotiations on the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. So The debates on all that usually starts around the March or April timeframe, and they go on throughout the summer, and then eventually, hopefully if everything goes right, you get a defense bill, and that's going on right now. Some of you have probably seen some of that in the paper. So it was perfect timing. The women are running on this high, and it's perfect timing to get something slipped into a defense bill. And Pat Schroeder and Beverly Byron did just that in the House. They slipped in provisions to repeal the combat exclusion laws. That sailed through the House, so passed in May of 1991, and it just it literally gobsmacked people who didn't want women in combat, because they did not see this coming. So you had your anti-feminists, you had the service chiefs, all these people were like, oh my gosh, and so they went on the offensive, and they started going over to the Senate and trying to telling the Senate, you can't do this, you got to not pass this bill. We've got to keep those laws in place. And they did some pretty heavy-duty lobbying. John McCain was initially a big supporter of repealing the law, and he kind of started wobbling. Well, once McCain starts wobbling, everybody's listening to him, and so things were not looking good for the home team here. Until and the women were, they were writing their congressmen and stuff, so they were doing everything they can, the women military aviators, but then they were getting ready to go to the vote in July in the Senate. And July 18th, there was a Washington Times article. A female reporter went down and flew in the backseat of an F-15 at Langley Air Force Base. And when she got back, she wrote up that, well, she could understand why men didn't want flying these airplanes, didn't want women flying these airplanes, because it was pretty hard, And she didn't think about the fact that maybe she didn't really have the experience to be flying that aircraft. But anyway, she wrote this article, and women pilots read this article, and they were furious. So, and one woman in particular, Heather Wilson, who was not a pilot, but she was a graduate from the Air Force Academy, and she had gotten out of the Air Force because she declined to go to pilot training, and she'd gotten out of the Air Force because she couldn't be a combat pilot. That was one of the reasons. And she was getting into politics by now, and she was later a Secretary of the Air Force. But she called the women military aviators, and she said, activate your Rolodexes. Now, for you young people in the crowd, that's this little thing that used to hold your business cards and stuff. So no iPhones back in those days. So yeah. And then in the meantime, you had another woman who was very instrumental in this whole thing, Carolyn B. Craft. She had been a former Army dietitian, and she had gotten out of the Army when she got pregnant back in the 60s. Remember, she had to do that. So, and she had been a longtime advocate for women also. And she also called the women military aviators and said, look, you need to get here to Washington now. So women military aviators from all over the world, some as far away as Hawaii, took leave, put on their uniforms, flew into Washington, and basically stormed Capitol Hill, and they went around. Now, the women in uniform could not lobby, okay, but you can educate. And so they had women, so you had Carolyn B. Craft took some of the women, Heather Wilson took some of the women, and then you had a representative from the National Organization of Women that took the others, and they took them around to the various senators, their staffers, and the three non-military women, they did the advocating, and then the women in uniform, they did the educating. They said, this is how these laws affect my career. This is why I got out. I'm in the reserves now, that sort of a thing. So, and it was effective. So they did change some minds. This is some of the women. This is not all of the women. This picture was actually taken later. It was not taken that day, but this is some of the women that were involved in that. And can you imagine all these women showing up in your office and saying, you really, this law really hurts me, and then you've got Heather Wilson going, yeah, you need to change it, okay? So yeah. So July 31st, the Senate did pass an amendment. Now, they did not pass the bill exactly that the House passed, but they did pass an amendment, or they did pass a bill that repealed the law, but they also passed an amendment that required a commission before the services would actually implement this. So this is a time-honored tradition in the military. If you don't want to do something, you do a study. And if you don't get the results that you want, you do another study. So this was essentially a delaying tactic on the part of the Department of Defense. So unfortunately, late in 1992, the commission, they were a little bit biased, but they recommended that flying in combat remain closed to women. But what else happened in late 1992, for those of you who are around? Bill Clinton got elected. And one of the things that he had said during his campaign was that he was in favor of allowing women to go into combat. So there was a change in administration in January of 1993, and it still took a few more months. Nothing ever happens fast, it seems. But a few months later, in April 1993, Les Aspin finally ordered the services to open combat aircraft to women. And that very same day when he announced that, General Merrill McPeak, who had been one of the most vocal advocates against women being in combat aircraft, introduced the first 3 female fighter pilots, women who would become fighter pilots in the United States. Because I guess he was tired of the Navy beating him with a punch on everything. He wanted to make a big splash. So he went out and found 3 very highly qualified women and introduced them that day. And one of them is pictured here, Jeannie Flynn, who is now a 2-star general. Last name is now Levitt, Jeannie Levitt. It was also Martha McSally, who some of you may recognize her name, and then Sharon Pressler, who went on to become an F-16 pilot. So the door was finally open, and it's been open since. And this is just a handful of representation of some of the women and some of the women who have been able to fly combat aircraft and some of the things that they've done. Like I said, Martha McSally, I think a lot of you recognize her name. She was the first woman to actually log a combat sortie in a combat aircraft. So flying an A-10, and I think it was in 1995. So even though Jeannie Flynn was the first fighter pilot who actually was qualified, she didn't actually log a combat sortie until later. So you've got Tammy Duckworth. I think a lot of you probably recognize her name. So she was shot down in Iraq and lost her legs there. Amy McGrath recently ran for Congress and didn't make it, was defeated, but she was an F-18 pilot with the Marine Corps. And you've got Kim Campbell. Some of you may have heard her story. She was hit in 2003 over Iraq, and she was flying an A-10, and she almost lost control of the aircraft because of the damage to it, but she flew it back to her home base and was awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross for that. Heather Penny was one of 2 pilots who launched on 9/11 out of DC to go find United Flight 93. And they didn't know that the aircraft had crashed by then, but they were planning to ram the aircraft with their F-16s because they had just come back from a training exercise, and the aircraft did not have any weapons loaded on them at all. And so her flight lead and her were planning to fly their F-16s into Flight 93 if they had to keep that aircraft from hitting whatever its intended target was. So, and she, if you ever get a chance to hear her talk, she has a really good presentation that she gives on that. So, and then last is kind of where we are now. You've got Kristen Beowulf. Some of you may have seen her fly. She's the current F-35 demonstration pilot, and she really makes a lot of noise. So she puts on an amazing display. And the thing that's nice about it now is that this is normal. If you go back and you read the announcements about when she was selected as the F-35 demonstration pilot, they don't say, oh, first woman selected to fly the F-35 as a demonstration pilot. No, there's all this article about all her great stuff that she's accomplished and everything, and then you get down to the very, very end of the article and they say, and the reporter says, so do you have any thoughts about being the first woman to be the F-35 demonstration pilot? So thank goodness that we're finally getting away from the first, right? That it just becomes normal that women fly F-35s in air shows. So I'll open it up for questions now. And there's a lot more to this that I can't possibly tell you in just 45 minutes. but I will open it for questions now. And as I said, sorry for the glitch that we weren't able to get books here today to sell to you, but they are available on Amazon. I put those cards out there. I'm happy to sign a card for you. I know it's not the same thing as getting a signature in a book, but thank you everybody for listening. Got a question back there, so. So they were going to ram it and bail. So yeah, that was the question. So yeah, they were thinking that, well, if we hit it, one was going to take the nose, one was going to take the tail, and they were thinking that, well, if we do it right, we could hit it and pull our ejection handle, and actually it's just a single, yeah. Yeah, the Germans did some of that in World War II. Yeah, so, but that's what, like I said, they were, they figured that was the only way they were going to bring it down, so they were willing to do that. So yeah. So, yes. Mm-hmm. Oh. So asked if I was a pilot. I was not a pilot. I was a flight test engineer. And I was like Leslie Kenny there, so I flew in the back seat of F-4s and F-16s up at Edwards Air Force Base. I flew in 141s and 130s. I flew in a whole bunch of different aircraft as a flight test engineer. But I knew from the beginning that there was no reason women shouldn't be flying these airplanes. I mean, I was flying in the back seat just fine, and I got a lot of stick time. And the airplane doesn't know the gender of the person flying. So yeah. Yes, you had a question? Yeah. What year did I start? So I came in the Air Force in 1980. So I came in the same year as the first group of women graduated from the Air Force Academy. So yeah. So I didn't come in right as soon as I finished college. So in fact, I had really no interest in the military when I got out of high school, because I was like, why would I join the military? I didn't have any role models. I mean, my dad was actually in the Air Force, but he wasn't really a role model. So I went through college, and then I worked for a little bit when I got out of college, and I was just kind of bored, and I went and talked to the Air Force recruiter, and by then women could do just about everything in the military, I mean, not combat obviously still, but by then it looked a lot more attractive to me, and so I decided to take a chance and come in, and it worked out just fine for me. So yeah. So yes. Yeah. So the question was, what are some key milestones or memories from my career? So I would say probably the biggest milestone for me was going to test pilot school. So, and it's interesting how things work out. I didn't know anything about test pilot school when I came in the Air Force, but I figured, once I got to OTS, I'd been at OTS for, I don't know, probably about 6 weeks, and I started to realize that if you're going to be in the Air Force, you probably should be flying, especially if you're an officer. And my dad had been a pilot, but my eyes weren't good enough to go to pilot training. Nowadays, you could get your eyes fixed, but back then you couldn't. And so I thought, well, maybe I could be a navigator. And I started thinking about applying to navigator training after I got in the Air Force, because they brought me in as an engineer. And I was thinking about that. But then, it was the same thing. It was the combat exclusion. I thought, well, if I do that, I'm going to go fly 141s or something. And not that there was anything wrong with that, but I really liked the idea of flying in an F4 and F-15. and then I met a guy one day who was telling me about this place that he worked at called Holloman Air Force Base, and he was a flight test engineer, and he got to fly in the back of an F4, and I was like, I want to do that, So anyway, I never got to fly in the back of an F4 at Holloman, but I got there, and I flew on 141s and 130s, and that was just an amazing job for a lieutenant. I was up testing inertial navigation systems. Another thing, kids, we didn't have GPS in those days. We had these things called inertial navigation systems, and so that was my job, was to fly around on C-130s and C-141s and test these things, and I loved it. I loved the flight testing. It's a very dynamic environment, and so then that was also around that same time I learned about that engineers could go to test pilot school, so I applied and got accepted, and so that was probably one of the big first milestones, was getting to test pilot school, graduating, and then probably another big event was I was on the C-17 program. So I was on it. I got on the program in 1989, so they were still a couple years away from first flight, and I was able to kind of oversee all of the test planning and everything. I was actually at Wright-Patterson at the time, and was called a program office, so I was no longer flying, but I was back out at Edwards for the first year of the flight test program, and I was sitting in the control room when the aircraft took off on its first flight from Long Beach, and flew up to Edwards. I was in the control room at Edwards. They did a handoff to us once they got up over the mountains. And that's one of those things, you know, when you're a captain, I'm just doing my job. I wasn't really thinking about it. Later on, you know, now I look back on it, I go, that was a really cool thing to be involved in. You know, if you ever get the opportunity to be involved in the first flight of an aircraft, it's just an amazing thing. So all of the stuff that went into it, all the preparations, and, you know, lots of lessons learned. And so, yeah, if you ever get that opportunity, that's a great one. So, yeah, go ahead. Yes, so the question was, 18-year-old girl, what path should she take if she wants to be a fighter pilot or a professional pilot? Yeah, the door's wide open, and that's what's really great is, you know, there's no single path to being a pilot. You know, there are plenty of pilots who go to their local airport and they get their private pilot's license. You know, they maybe build some time and they can become a commercial pilot and an instructor, build their hours that way. You know, get on with a regional airline, eventually get on with an airline. You can go to an aviation-related college. You can go to like Embry-Riddle or University of North Dakota. You know, there's lots of places where they have programs where you get your licenses while you're at the school. And same thing, you build time, you know, or you can let the military pay for it. Yeah, so you can get a scholarship through ROTC, or you can go to one of the academies. Academies are a little harder to get into, but again, it's you know, it's a paid 4-year education. If you're interested in being a fighter pilot, that's probably one of the better avenues to take. It's less risky if you go ROTC. When they cut pilot training slots, they come out of ROTC first. Yeah, they want to get your academy grads through. So yeah, there's just so many ways to do things, and you can also go get your licenses by, you know, on your own, and then maybe apply later to the Air Force. And you can go through OTS, you know, get your degree and everything. So there are age limits to things. There also are, it's not just active duty. The reserves are always looking for pilots. The Air National Guard is always looking for pilots. The National Guard, you know, there are just many avenues out there to become a professional pilot or a military pilot. So if you go down one road and it doesn't work out, then just, you know, turn around and go find that other road, and don't give up. So yeah, but yeah, it's pretty wide open right now. So yeah. Yes. Who is the first female fighter pilot in an aerial victory? There has not been one. So I can't even remember. I think the last time we had an aerial victory was sometime back in the 90s. So yeah, it's been a while. So we may have had one in the Gulf War. I mean, in the more recent wars. I'd have to go back and look. So yeah, there's not very many aerial victories anymore. So yeah. Yes. Yes, there were, yeah, so you have had women, like you said, A-10 pilots shooting up tanks and things like that. But in actual air-to-air combat, no, I'm not aware that that's taken place, so yeah. So, yeah, one more question, so sorry. Yeah. So where did I go to undergraduate and what was my degree in? So my undergraduate, I went to the University of Washington up in Seattle. Any Huskies here? So no, I guess I'm in the wrong place. So yeah, and my undergraduate degree was actually in computer science. So, however, if you can stand one more answer here, when I joined the Air Force was short on engineers, and so they were taking people like me. I had the first 2 years of undergraduate engineering. So I had differential equations, you know, physics, you know, calculus-based physics, all that kind of stuff. They were taking people like me and sending us to the Air Force Institute of Technology to get a second bachelor's degree in aero or electrical engineering. I figured they'd send me for electrical because I was a computer science person. They sent me as an aero, and I was like, oh, well, maybe I can change when I get there. Well, they wouldn't let me change, but that's okay. I actually turned out to really like aero engineering, and I survived the course, and everything went from there. So I'm both computer science and aero engineering, and I would say that has been actually a really good combination of degrees, because I got into the Air Force just as, you know, software was really starting to take off in airplanes. And software became much more important in our day-to-day flight testing jobs as well. And so having that ability to kind of speak both languages, I think really helped me a lot during my career. So if you're doing engineering now, and I think nowadays engineering students do learn a lot about programming and stuff more than they did when I went through. But yeah, knowing a lot about computers is a good thing no matter what career field you're in. So. Okay, thank you very much. I'll be around for questions.